Ed, I think you're muted.
You are correct. Thank you. So we made a short meeting today because I only have a few items to discuss today. I had asked Richard to talk about the multiple control plane upgrade support. He wanted to, but had a conflict. He wants to make sure that people are looking at that item as well as the PR he has for uninstall. Let's pull up his document. A design for uninstall, remove one control plane version, and prune the associated resources. There is a PR for this that is out there. I would encourage everyone to look at it. I gave it a look through today. I thought that it looked like a good start. Has anyone taken a look at that? Let me see if I have that open in another window. This is it. That's just a direct link to my review. So we don't need to review it fully today, but I would encourage everyone to take a look at it, especially people who are here from environments who have an opinion about the features here and how we'll be able to uninstall and upgrade, and is this sufficient for the jobs that we have. I don't think I can really do justice to this PR or the proposal myself. I added some comments feeling that it was insufficient to only have revision for an argument. There are more parameters in the PR. I thought that it needed an option to remove a particular Istio operator CR, and that would remove everything associated with that particular CR, which I did not see in his command line stuff. The other item that I have is my PR for a new version of Istio Cuddle version. So I wanted to discuss how that would work. As you remember, I have been hard at work on the commands for central Istio case. Can Istio Cuddle talk directly without Kubernetes to Istio D and do things? What I'm about to show you is a PR that does that just for version, and it was fairly small. So I believe this is the story that Costin and John agreed to last week, that there'll be two ways that this will work. If there is a central Istio D endpoint, we will connect to it by gRPC, and it will pick a random pod, and we'll do everything against that single pod. However, if we're in a Kubernetes environment, we will continue port forwarding into each pod. However, we will use the XDS endpoints within those pods rather than the current debug and version APIs. So this PR is fairly small, and it does that. For it to do the correct thing, there's a second PR that I had to write. So there's a new Envoy protocol buffer feature called control plane that can come as a response to XDS. And we're now populating that with double wrapped JSON, we will be if this PR merges. So this now in the identifier field, that's the only field in this control plane response. We get a double wrap JSON, or I mean, it's a string, it's wrapped, deserialized, coming as a protobuf. We get the component, which I've been setting to pilot instead of istio-d. We get an ID, which I've been setting to the pod name, although we might want to customize that in the future to be the pilot ID if that's feasible. And then we have the existing Istio build info struct that we have always had before. So with this PR, that is now being returned. And with this other PR, we have an experimental version of the version command. And it takes parameters. Let me show those parameters. This is not my version with that command present. Okay, well, I can't show them directly. Let me build that in the background while we wait. So it's fairly simple. The version command has always had a strange API, so this code is overly complex, but we do actions because part of version is to get the sidecar information, which may or may not be used. And I have a new multi-XDS package that will either contact a single central Istio-d via REST, or it will contact via port forward all of the Istio-d's Kubernetes cluster. So if you defined a central endpoint, Kubernetes is totally out of the picture, which should be great. Well, maybe not out of the picture. We still create one and don't use it. I don't know how it's going to fly in a VM environment. The code itself, these are the options I was going to show. The XDS address, certificates, which will be replaced hopefully with security that Istio itself can do if we can make that happen, and the label if the user has installed a special version of Istio. The code itself is fairly tiny, the same stuff we saw before, to query each shard and merge them. So let's see if I can give a demo of it now. Did I not check it out? I had the wrong thing checked out. The code itself underneath uses what had formerly been the test client, ADSC, to contact XDS. And I have never been able to get this to debug. If anyone knows sort of how to make that happen, let me know. It would be a great follow-on PR to debug problems with XDS from the client. So these are the options. So it's now port forwarding into the Istio pods. So this may wait the full 30 seconds and time out because I believe I just reinstalled 161 rather than the latest version. So this may be a very boring demo.
Ed, have you heard any pushback on this from networking or anything like that yet?
I've gotten no comments on it from networking.
Okay.
So let me run Istio locally, which was built with it. While Pilot is running, excuse my slow typing. Okay, so here's what happened. I'm running Pilot locally on my laptop. I did so that it would use that version of Pilot rather than going through Kubernetes. It, as always, determined my command line version. This build locally did not include the control plane identifier I discussed, and there were no pods running on this data plane, so you don't see it. But if that other patch had been here, this would have shown the control plane version, and if there were pods being controlled by my laptop, this 2D, the data plane stuff would be here. All the other commands work identically. I don't make any changes to the version command itself. It's the same Istio wide version command. It's just the code that populates the data structure that it uses. So that makes the PR remarkably small for what it's doing. I think it gives us a way forward for the other commands once we have protobufs sort of for them.
I may have missed this, but how do we handle multiple pilots at all, or SDODs?
So we do handle them. Currently, Carsten had suggested, and as an experiment, I implemented it, XDS label, so that you could supply a label when you have more than one Istio-D in your Istio system, different control planes. This is used to identify the pods. That is one way to do it. The other way to do it is, if you're not using Istio, supplying a different address here. So each XDS address is going to identify uniquely a control plane. It may also be that we want a default for this. So I've been suggesting that there be some kind of variable XDS adder or Istio adder that becomes the default. And if that's defined, it would sort of always go there, bypassing Kubernetes completely.
So how does the label thing work under the hood?
The label thing works. So you would it does a if supplied. So if there is if this is not supplied and this is supplied, it's going to do a Kubernetes git pods in the Istio namespace matching this label to identify which control plane pods there were. So instead of Istio pilot, you could specify istio.io/canary.
So that's how it lists pods. Then does it send a request to every pod, or how does that part work?
Right. So I wanted the behavior to be as close as it is today. So all pods that match, it does a port forward. And let me show you that code because it, like I say, it was surprisingly small. So if there is XDS, we do XDS. Be better to validate that we didn't have both arguments here, but that can come later. So if there was no XDS, we're going to query each shard and then merge the shards. To query them, we are sending in that label, which currently defaults to sort of all pilots, but could default to just a single control plane. And then we're going to, this is just the get Istio pods we've always had. It's going to give a list of pods. For each pod, we will build a port forwarder. Currently, we're sending it to the insecure port, which may not be turned on unless you have it in all profiles. So once we have that security stuff in, we're going to want to use the secure port. We start the port forward. We call address, which will be a local host address on a random port. And then basically that's all we do. So now we have a list of responses that are all of the same form. So each pod has given us a discovery response. The merge is pretty simple. It just takes sort of the a random response and starts merging the resources together that it found. So if you have 10 shards of Istio running locally, they'll all be merged.
So then what would the user see in that case? We've got responses from, say, 10 different pilot instances, hopefully each with the same version, right?
Right. So
different versions.
Yes, the existing code in version, if you remember, it always give a count of the types of pods and their control plane versions. So
Okay.
if you ran Istio Cuddle version today with 2 control planes, it would say you have 3 STODs on 161 and 3 STODs on 162 or something like that.
Okay.
That code is all unchanged. So I was hoping for at least directional responses from Costin or John about this PR. Maybe they're too busy. I will try to bug them some more. Liam, if you have anything that might relate to how you're using VMs and stuff, I think this should be great. I wanted to ask you sort of one question, which was initially I had passed into my helper all of the parameters that were needed to build that Kubernetes client. Where is that code? So initially I passed in the kube config, the kube context, and the revision so that within that code it could build a client. I think these methods, kube client with revision and stuff, I don't know what they sort of do if you don't have a Kubernetes config. I've never tested it with that. Is it, I know they don't do any IO if you call this, but they may be reading, I mean, no network IO, they may be reading your local configuration. I would guess that's wrong. We shouldn't even be reading your Kubernetes configuration if you supply that XDS address. What do you think?
I think that's probably correct, yes. In terms of VMs, as long as there's like a specific address to go to, I think that's fine for now. We can work out if there's any optimizations we can do later or any wrappers.
So this wrapper that I had written, I'm not sure. First I tried passing in all of these settings to build my Kubernetes client. I also tried passing in like a callback, like JSON style, like if there's nothing good here in the XDS address, call the callback to get one of these clients. It all seemed ugly, which made me think that I should bring this code out of a library and make it all explicit here, but that seemed ugly too. Did you have any thoughts on how this should be sort of structured to make it really easy to make a request independent of if it's going to be eventually port forwarded or a direct call?
Not particularly, I guess. Are you passing kube client in there? I'll take a look and see if, but I don't, not particularly off the top of my head, rather than like make it into composable chunks and then compose it in two different functions.
Yeah, it seemed hard, and it seemed hard to even know if you should pass a nil in to this thing. So if you have any thoughts on the best way to structure that, let me know.
Jude, I'm here now.
So those were the only two topics I had for today's call. Do we have any other topics? Mitch, do we have any other topics for today's call? I had sort of a light schedule here.
I don't think so. Yeah, it's going to be light probably until we're able to reach a consensus with networking on how to move forward here.
Okay.
We last week, so for those on the call, last week networking asked us to start moving forward, designing a CSDS service, and actually they asked us to start implementing. We got a partway through implementation, wrote a design doc, and no longer have consensus with the networking group. They are objecting to the number of config dumps that could potentially be generated by a CSDS service. So we're kind of back to the drawing board there.
What is CSDS?
Client Status Discovery Service. Envoy has defined as a part of the XDS spec a way of getting information like config dumps and whether a given client is up to date with your XDS service, which are two of the key things that we'd like to do with Istio Cuddle. And so we would like to be able to do those in a way that is consistent with how every other XDS and Envoy installation is doing it. But we've got some objection.
Yeah, so let me back off and say that the way that this version command I just showed you worked was that it used a new request, Istio connections that Costin sort of made up.
Yep.
And it returns sort of a vast number of configuration of each connection. There seem to be these protobufs that would return things in a more Envoy style, but I think that the problem is we don't have a good request for it. Would you say that's how to characterize it, Mitch?
No, the request is defined. The service is pretty well defined as it's got request and response mode and streaming mode. Where the breakdown is that by default, CSDS returns not only the status of a connection, like it's synced, it's stale, or it's unknown, or something along those lines, but also all of the config that's intended for that connection. And the networking team is concerned that that will not be performant, that generating that many config dumps could be problematic. So there's a number of possibilities, such as the command supports node matchers, so you can limit the number of nodes that you're collecting data on. I think eventually what we may be able to get them to agree to is when a node matcher specifies a single node, then we return a config dump. Otherwise, we return only status. My concern is just that whatever limitations we place on this, that we are still compatible with Envoy tooling. Envoy will be releasing tools specifically for this service in the future, and I would like for them to work on Istio as well as every other place Envoy is used.
So I've brought up on the screen the CSDS from the Envoy documentation. And you'd say this is for our proxy status command, right? I mean, this is what it's for.
Proxy status and config dump could both be satisfied by this, yeah.
Yeah. So the idea is Pilot would implement this, which it currently does not, and we would use it instead of the connections that you saw me doing in my example of proxy status.
It might be. Is there any way within CSDS to say, basically some way we can extend CSDS to say, only give me one, or yes, I want to out of memory myself, please, thanks.
Yeah, my thought on that is the node matchers that we're allowed to specify. It supports several nodes. There's an exact match, a regex match, prefix, as well as suffix-based matching. My thought is we can probably get the networking team to agree that if a specific node is specified with exact match, that then we should include the config dump. And perhaps if it's in anything but exact match mode, there would not include config dumps with it. I'm not sure about Envoy compatibility there, as their tooling is not yet written, so it's hard to see how they would handle that.
It seems very ad hoc to do it that way, although it seems like a very efficient answer. Has anyone from Envoy implemented this API, and what did they return?
The traffic director team at Google has implemented this in a closed source manner, and it appears that it returns full config dumps.
I wonder, okay, so if we just have a conversation with the networking group and say, stick it behind an environment variable and have it off by default, right? And then if users want to actually do that and they're aware of the consequences, then they can enable it if they want.
Yeah,
I agree they get full tooling compatibility.
Thus far, that's been a non-starter with the networking team, but I agree with you that does sound reasonable to me.
Okay.
Are they concerned with the API in with IstioD implementing the service, or with Istio calling the service?
Both.
So if the problem is, if they're just concerned about IstioD implementing the service because of performance, that is not common to Istio, based on what I understand of this being a Envoy service, Envoy API. So this issue would exist elsewhere. So if there is a need for additional filtering, it seems like the right place to do that would be in this through the Envoy community, where you add, maybe there's a filter option.
Right.
I wonder if if something's experimental, are they still concerned about sort of like the off by default case? Pilot implements it, it's there, maybe it's always on, but if we never call it, we don't incur the performance hit. And the experimental command is sufficiently guarded right now so that somebody's not going to accidentally lock up Istio.
We might be able to get that through. I think if This is a little bit difficult because I'm essentially imagining responses based on our communications over the last 2 weeks. But I expect that their response would be that that could never be enabled by default. It would never move out of experimental at that point.
Well, that's fine. So I think maybe what we can do is, and I think this is kind of similar to what Liam was suggesting, maybe implement it a little bit differently, but keep it off by default and say, if we turn it on by default, here are the numbers. They're horrible because things just lock up. And you can say it's not a problem with the client because the client is just calling the API. We don't have a sufficient API to do filtering. And then you just, somebody sends a PR to Envoy and says, hey, can we add another field? They add another field. If they agree it's a problem, and then the CLI can start using that. And then we can kind of figure out what the CLI syntax would be and what the default behavior is. Rather than trying to patch over it at the CLI level and have some heuristics that maybe don't exactly match the upstream API and there's incompatibilities.
Jason, that sounds reasonable. Can you use your influence with the networking group to try to help move us that direction? I can give you access to the design doc. Actually, I'll just drop a link to the design doc in our meeting notes. It probably should have been there anyway.
Yeah.
So our proxy status command for all pods sort of wants all of these, but for a single pod sort of wants all of these. I think that's the thing. There's no request one or the other.
Yeah. I mean, I guess for prototyping the experience of small clusters, you can kind of get everything, and then you can filter client side. So kind of a dual tracks. So you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you could make progress there and figure out how to parse things and what the right.
Oh yeah.
And then independently.
Too much data is not a problem.
Yeah. And then independently we figure out how to make it performant. And once it's performant based on either a pilot specific flag or special some special encoding in the match identifier or the actual upstream API change, then we can optimize the CLI.
Mitch, I'm worried about not getting this in for 1.7 and then having these two ways of doing things. This way, which is the real Istio connections, which I've been doing now. Do you think a performant version of this that maybe never returns the configs could be implemented to get us most of the way there?
Implementation wise, I have an early working copy locally. So I've already got the code written based on last week's meeting. The problem is pushing it through review. And no, I don't expect that we could probably push this through review in time for 1.7, given the controversy that it's already kicked up.
Should we then drop this now and return to it for 1.8? I don't want us to spend all of our time trying to get approval for something and then not have time to actually get it in 1.7.
Yeah, I agree. I think more or less all of the debug commands at this point, with the exception of what you've done on version, I don't think we have consensus pretty much anywhere at this point.
How many other cases are there like this, where there's lack of consensus on the underlying mechanism?
So the for central STOD, the idea is we have to get rid of the /debug, which will not be exposed, and the /version, which will not be exposed via the gateway. We want all the commands to work if there's no port forwarding happening. So this item 24114 tracks everything that needs to be done for the commands that talk to the control plane. The commands are wait, and I don't know if Mitch has an idea even for what the request and response should be.
No, we're still waiting for Costin on that. He volunteered to write a design for how request and response would look. I told him that that was not likely to work in the framework of XDS events. He sure is, but we're still waiting on that doc.
So do we think that it will Istio wait is not going to happen under central SDOD or VMs in the 1.7 timeframe?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, can you, or can I edit this to make it red or something? I gotta
Sure.
remember. All
I
right.
think I saw somewhere else you had marked dropped for 1.7. I can do
Yeah.
the same there.
I gotta make these, but some of these, when they're dropped, like, it may not be a biggish deal. So for proxy status, um, for users who are, have their own Istio cluster, we're going to port forward into all the ports. So it's not going to be a problem that we've dropped unsharding. For users who are on central SDOD, they're only going to see the status of their particular, of whoever they connect to, because we can't just keep reconnecting, hoping we get a different pilot. So at least they'll have some functionality, although maybe not what we want.
Well, and so right now the connections collection shows connection events. It does not show disconnect events, which may be problematic for us.
Yes, so there's a item for NACs or disconnects. You and Costin were going to be working on this, right?
So that is what CSDS replaces. That whole section, that was what we worked on.
But Costin, when he had done this stuff so I had this my poll here, this draft poll that uses the connections thing. Costin put a NACs endpoint in there, and he may have been willing to put other endpoints in. The question is, these weird events that are not documented by Envoy that Costin has just sort of made up, I couldn't even find them documented in the wiki, or there's any list of them anywhere. Just for the here, it would be good to have like a table of the things that we're allowed to call from the client that are not public APIs, but are experimental APIs that just keep the client functioning in 1.7, and then to track sort of those. So I can't just say, well, if CSDS goes in, then we're all set. Otherwise, we're not, because that makes this confusing. So the version thing I was able to tackle, and I think that's going to go with, although it's Costin's thing and not on CSDS, and then describe, which we have a problem. So let me bring that up. Oops, I clicked the wrong thing. So istio describe used to invoke debug so that it could find various things about security. So it does two things. It goes up to Envoy to get the configuration, and we're going to continue getting that from Envoy in this version, although we could get it from possibly CSDS in the control plane instead. But we used to call debug to get the authentication stuff. Is it TLS? Is it not TLS? It came from a debug endpoint. So we going to be kind of without that feature in the describe output if we don't have the debug endpoint. And I think that's a complete list of what is at stake here when we lose that debug endpoint in 1.7.
So can I ask a few questions about this for context, since I've been slowly kind of getting back into things? So we've got 3 weeks, 4 weeks until code complete?
We have 2 weeks until code complete.
2 weeks, okay. And for central SDOD, is that, are we calling that like are we tracking that through a feature stage? So saying like it's going to be alpha in 1.7, or it's going to be beta in production?
So I've been told it sort of works in 1.6, and it's sort of going to be alpha in 1.7, I believe.
Okay. So if
the problem is not users installing it, it's operators. IBM wants to install central SDOD so that we can administer people's clusters correctly without Istio being located and do upgrades. it also really helps with the multi-cluster stuff to be able to talk to Istio in one control plane and pods on another.
Right. I agree with the intent. I'm trying to figure out the sequencing.
Right. And
If
so
these didn't go in, so some of these, like the Istio cuddle weight, that is not a blocker. If these didn't go in, or some set of these didn't go in, would central Istio D be unusable?
So our documentation says things like use proxy status to check on the status of your proxies. And I was doing a lot of experimentation with WebAssembly, writing filters, putting them in Envoy filters. And if you screw up an Envoy filter, the proxy rejects it and you don't know it except through proxy status. The analyzer can't tell it because that Envoy filter is doing things that are only known, like the file name of a location on the sidecar. So anyone who's been using proxy status, that seems to be the big one. Lin Sun has been telling me I had to make it work so people can know if their proxies are good. And that's why I've been focusing so hard on it. It would be very frustrating to say, well, since your cloud provider is managing your Istio, you're not going to know if your Envoy filters have screwed up your sidecars.
Okay. So if Istio D is, say we're assuming it's going to be, I know IBM has their motivations, but putting that aside for a moment, if we're going to say this is beta, and we expect people to, realistically, they're going to start using it in some production environments, I don't think we can have regression with fundamental debug tools. So we either need to say that this needs to work, or you can't call Istio essential Istio beta in 1.7. And so that either means, there's proper, we get the necessary attention through escalation to resolve whatever consensus issues there are between groups, or we say it's going to go in 1.8, and that means central Istio is going to be alpha, or maybe there's some like intermediate thing that can kind of make people that want to use it earlier happy, but it would be less than ideal. So there might be some compromises, and any sort of consensus would be in that context. And I think it's only, my understanding is it's mainly proxy status. So the other things are either implemented or not. We can do without them. They're not fundamental tools. Does that sound accurate?
That makes sense to me. A lot of it, I think, could work better. I've did a prototype where I had a sort of a sprayer out here. So you'd expose this sprayer on the gateway, would talk to all the instances. XDS address would be slightly different. I mean, there's ways to hack it in. I don't know if you've been at any of these workgroup leads meeting that Shweta used to have on Tuesdays, except for this week. And it's always been me saying, look, I'm at risk because networking isn't tracking this issue.
Right.
And I'm saying, well, it'll be ready soon. And
right. So that's, yeah, I've been,
I don't know how to motivate them.
By doing what I said, I think, which is, okay, it's getting some agreement. So either people say, we don't really need proxy status. We can still, everybody agrees, and this might be, going to the leads or going to the TOC. We agree we can call central Istio, beta or whatever, without proxy status. And they say, yep, we're cool with that. Then there's not that much you could do in Istio Cuddle. There might be some like one-off tools that you might have to build. But if there is agreement, yes, we are not going to call beta unless we have that working, proxy status working. Then there's the two options. We push out the beta or whatever we're calling it, or we get some, we get people to nail things down sooner, because really it's 2 weeks, and that's not a lot of time, especially if we're counting this week where we're not, it's going to be difficult to get some of this done until a week from now.
Well, in addition, the difficulty with the 2-week time frame is that we don't have an agreed on design yet.
Right.
For Istio.io connections, there's no design doc for that. There's been no review on the format of it or how it works. Jason, to be frank, our options have been ignore Costin's refusal and move forward in our own direction, or just take whatever he's willing to contribute with no design doc, no review, no input. It's been unfortunate, but that's kind of been the state of affairs for the last 3 months.
Okay. Is there if you had to do something for proxy status without any, is there like, if I wanted to write a one-off tool and I could maybe just hack my own version of Istio to use, I could run proxy status, I could use it with central STOD, but it doesn't take a hard dependency on any of these changes in STOD.
So let's discuss. So this Istio.io connections is implemented, and I have a pull request that is more than a month old. It's a draft that uses it to do proxy status via central STOD. There's a few items that need to be done, like the security certificates, but it basically works. And where's the output is in here? Let's see. Well, I don't have a screenshot of the output, but it basically does a fine job doing proxy status. The problem, of course, is that it's talking to a random shard, and I could, on the client, just keep calling like a bunch of times until I start seeing a lot of duplication. And I could do a lot of hackery like that. I don't like it though, but that's sort of what I have.
Okay, so it's sharding.
Actually give you proxy status though? I thought this just showed us what connections exist, not what state they're in.
Well, sorry, it currently does not show everything. But it should be straightforward to add the new pieces in here. This new gen2.go, it has the handler for that code, I believe. So the resource generator, let me see. Well, this gives all the connections. One moment. Internal gen, that's where it was. So the disconnections are here, and there's these NACs that are here. So by looking at these NACs, I should be able to tell which pods have sort of rejected the code. However, I was unable to get the NAC stuff to work. There's this on NAC thing. It may be that I should do a deep dive on this tomorrow to try to get it working. It seemed not to work. And maybe start trying to fix it myself. I was unclear if Costin would accept me writing more of these.
So I don't think the NAC will actually allow us to build proxy status. For instance, when a proxy is stale, that's one of the available states that we have in the command. That's not necessarily due to NACs, right?
I'm not sure on exactly how the proxy rejects things. I know Liam just dropped, and that was sort of his specialty.
It's not so much the proxy rejecting as not yet receiving. So a proxy is stale if the XDS server thinks it's sent a certain version of the config, but the proxy is not aware of that version of the config. It has not acknowledged it. It hasn't NAC'd it. It hasn't responded whatsoever.
Yeah, so it may be that I need to write like an on stale or something to get that. I remember Pilot keeping these nonces and getting nonces back from Envoy, and I have not looked at that code in a year and a half. But in theory, anyone here could write this networking code. Do you think we should?
And I'll say again, I'm very wary of building on top of things that have no design, uh, no review, no consensus, no documentation. I think that, well, I've been saying this since May. I think building on top of XDS events is a very bad plan right now.
Well, we tried to propose our own API, and Costin would not accept it.
Yep.
I don't. I think it may be too late to put our own API in. What do you think?
I agree. I think that we need to push Costin in 1.8 to actually deliver a real design for these things, and not just be blasting code with no review.
So it sounds like there's maybe two tracks. There's long-term 1.8, try to do things properly with approved designs that everybody agrees with, and that's not shifting. For 1.7, I was trying to ask this question about like, is there a mitigating implementation? Is that, do we need that, or is it just, would that affect somebody like IBM who's wanting to who's wanting to use this for a hosted, like they're going to run the control plane for somebody else? Is that the primary concern for 1.7?
I don't want Lynn to feel like I let her down. So I put in my sample PRs, there's two out there now. I put these commands under experimental, but with the same output as the existing ones, with the idea that at least for 1.7 alpha, we would have both things available, and we could be testing them together and maybe get some attention on them. And the idea was for 1.7 beta that we would get anything that we felt was stable out of experimental into the main path, and anything that we could not contain would stay in experimental, and we would tell using under central STOD, you can use the experimental one in 1.7. It's not the answer I want to give people, but I don't want to say, well, I got nothing for you. Wasn't even thinking about your problem.
Yeah, I guess my concern is like, we've more than once in the past kind of had this, we've kind of done something that's good enough for a particular release, but it's not fully fleshed out, and things aren't maybe not completely, it's not like there's a nice package. Here is this feature, it's fully tested, there's full CLI support, there's full control plane support, everything's kind of incrementally launched. And so you can say, well, we have control plane support, multiple control plane support in a particular version, but not fully. And it's, it can be a bit confusing, I think. It'd be nice if we could kind of have everything at the same time. Maybe that's not possible. So, I mean, I would be, I think, generally in favor if we could do this right in 1.8. I was just trying to understand for 1.7, doing something experimental, I think is better. It might be confusing to have two version commands and two proxy status commands. So there might be ways to kind of like change the syntax around that, like maybe through an experimental flag, or like use XDS flag and say this is will eventually be the default. If there's something with sharding, for if sharding is the issue, like you can't just keep asking, you can't just issue requests and hope you eventually reach everybody. There might be things that are like IBM could do, or that are provider specific, to kind of mitigate that until there's better upstream support. So for example, maybe you have a proxy, and you that you control a proxy service. You call your XDS connections and say, hey, give me config for everybody. That thing that this new service that you implement can do the the demuxing. It could go and ping all of the control plane instances. You're kind of shifting it to be a server-side problem that's provider-specific.
Right. And then on the client side, they're just using the XDS address flag, right?
Right. So you just pass a single address in,
Right.
and then hopefully, if we get things together for 1.8, you could use that same tool and call 1.8 IstioD, and IstioD itself would do that. If it's simply a fan out, it's work. Something has to be launched, but it sounds straightforward. You're doing a query label. You're doing the same sort of thing you would do on the client anyway. You're going to search by label and then connect to each.
So I had an earlier version of these slides that showed that. Let me see if I may not have them now. So there had been an earlier version that had a piece out here that sort of, if it got this particular request, it would talk to all of the IstioDs. It was felt that that was confusing, and that it would be better if each IstioD talked to its siblings when one of these requests came in.
Sure.
And if that was HTTP, I would sort of know how to do it. When it's gRPC, I got a little confused about timeouts and what was going to happen, but I could imagine myself writing that. So I could imagine that for 1.7, when this happens, I'm sort of subscribing to my other siblings and asking them this question. I think that would be possible. I think Costa liked it. He wanted these events to sort of flow. He didn't like this picture, but
well, I think
it wouldn't have
regardless
to go
of which
into.
one is. Go ahead.
It could go into a IBM image or something needed to deliver it that way.
Yeah, I mean that. I think long term, you like, what's the API? I issue a request to some service, and that service should provide the results of everything. If there's agreement on that, then we're talking about the implementation. If we have an implementation that's sort of alpha quality for, if everybody needs this, and then it would have to be an IstioD. If it's something that just needed in 1.7 by something like IBM, then maybe that's something that is a one-off thing that gets thrown away in 1.8. And you can say, yeah, this is not ideal. It'd be great if this was upstream, but that's not happening. So instead of trying to like toss it in quick and dirty in 1.7 and deal with all the repercussions from that, it might be easier to manage as a separate change in your specific deployment. I don't know. And then we can spend the time actually discussing like the right way to do it and not getting hung up on like, what do we need to rush in for 1.7?
Well, unfortunately, we spent an entire release discussing this. Not a lot of forward from here.
Okay. Well, I think that's something else to maybe outside of this particular issue that we need to figure out.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Well, we reached the top of the hour. I appreciate you. You haven't shown us a picture of the new baby, but maybe that can wait until I've ended screen sharing and recording.
We can finish up the official meeting, and then we can.
Okay.
I can share.
Do we have anything else?
I don't think so.
I'm stopping the recording.